going to need you to focus now. I'm sure each of us has heard these words at some point in our lives. Maybe it was a teacher giving us critical directions before a test. Maybe it was a coach giving us an important play. Or maybe it was someone giving us directions in the midst of an emergency. Regardless of where or how you heard these words, the meaning is almost always the same. Essentially, it means that we have to shift our focus off of other things and onto something that's most important. Let's go back to the example of your coach. Maybe what he or she was saying in that moment was this: hey, stop paying attention to the scoreboard and your pain. Stop paying attention to your frustration and listen to what I'm about to tell you. You see, focus is a funny thing. Some of us really have a difficult time focusing on just one thing, and we often find ourselves focusing on many different projects or ideas at once. Sometimes we struggle to focus because times are difficult or we're hurting. See, have you ever tried to take a test after your heart's been broken? It's not much fun, is it? Other times we simply find ourselves focusing on the wrong things. I have to admit that there are times I've sat in church and focused more on a conversation that I needed to have afterwards than being present for God in the worship and in the teaching. Let's just admit that sometimes focus, and specifically focusing on the right thing, is hard. You see, if our current state of affairs with the coronavirus has taught us anything, it's been focus. For example, right now, so many people are focused on fear. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a need to take proper medical precautions, but how often have we seen people leap from one scary headline to another and act and react out of that same fear? For others, our focus is only on the negative: the current economy, the situation with jobs and employment, the loss of income, the shutdown of our normal modes of life. For others, their focus is on the government, what they're doing or not doing, whether they believe they've taken the proper steps or they're totally failing. But either way, their focus is solely on the government's response to the current scenario. But here's what I want you to see. Not that paying attention to any of these things is necessarily bad. In most cases, it's actually good to be informed and aware. But when these things become the center of our focus, we miss out on what God is doing right in front of us. Followers of Jesus firmly believe that God is always in control, even in trying times. However, isn't it funny how so many of us, in the midst of those trying times, allow our focus to shift from Jesus to something else? You see, Peter learned this lesson the hard way, didn't he? If you've ever read that famous passage of Scripture in Matthew 14, verses 22 through 33, where you're probably already aware of the scenario. It's a stormy night. The boat that the disciples are on is out away from land, and so what's Jesus do? He goes walking out onto the water to Peter. Peter, in all of his excitement and his laser-like focus on Jesus, decides that he wants to step out of the boat and walk to Jesus on the water, so he asks for permission. And what does Jesus say? Come. So Peter takes that fateful step out of the boat, and so for a few shining moments, things are going great. He's walking out on the water to Jesus. But then something happens. He shifts his focus from Jesus to the storm, to the wind and the waves, to the imminent danger and peril that he's in. And ultimately, you know the rest of the story, right? Jesus has to pull Peter up out of the waves and help him to the boat. And, at the end of the story, we see that there's this crazy connection between our focus and our doubts that Jesus points out to Peter. He says, "Ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" The same could be true of us. When we shift our focus off of Jesus, doubts start to creep in. The wind and the waves, they seem scarier in those moments. The situation we're in seems much more perilous, and we begin to focus more on the peril than in God's divine goodness. We focus more on the noise of the storm than in God's power, and inevitably, we sink. Jesus actually provides a great blueprint for how we keep our focus on God. In the midst of being tried by Satan in the desert, Jesus himself remains laser focused on God. And each time that Satan tries to get him to shift his focus to things like food, control, or power, Jesus responds with Scripture. He refuses to shift his perspective away from God to the things that most of us spend our days worrying about. The Apostle Paul himself writes about the importance of our focus in 2 Corinthians 10:5, saying, "We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ." Think about that for a second. Take captive every thought. Choose today who and what you'll focus on. In the midst of trying times like these, we should follow Jesus' example. Let's refuse to focus on the things that the world around us is currently focusing on. Yes, of course, pay attention, stay informed, be safe, but don't lose your focus on Christ. Because when we do, when fear and doubt inevitably set in, it's nearly impossible to see what God is doing. And have no doubt, that God is moving. He's at work in and around us. Romans 8:28 tells us this, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." And I know sometimes it's easy to read that passage of Scripture and think that that only applies to the good times in our lives. But the reality is, that also applies to the bad times, to the trials, to the struggles that we go through. That God is working all of those things for His good, for our good, and we need to be open and aware of that. God is working things out for His purposes, and we don't want to miss out on what He is doing by choosing to focus on the wrong things. So today, I want you to take a few minutes of personal devotion time, and I want to encourage you to read Matthew 14:22 through 33 for yourself. Now, I don't want you just to read it alone, but I want you to put yourself in Peter's shoes as you're reading this passage of Scripture. Consider things like this. What must have Peter been feeling to see Jesus walking to him on the wind and the waves and the water? What would that first step have felt like when he got out of the boat? How about this? Can you relate to Peter's fear when he took his eyes off of Jesus and began to sink? And as you think about those things, here's some questions I want to leave you with. Think about this. What are some things right now that are trying to pull your focus away from Jesus? Is it fear? Is it worry? Is it concern? Is it stocking full of enough supplies for your house, for your family? Is it your job? Is it the uncertainty that lies ahead of you? But what are those things that are trying to pull you away and pull your focus away from Jesus? And with that in mind, then what are some practical ways that we can keep focused? Even as things are vying for attention and trying to get us to focus on other things, how can we remain focused? Next one's this. How do we do as Paul advised and to take captive every thought? But that's a tough one, isn't it? So many thoughts are running through our heads, especially in times of fear and uncertainty. So how do we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ? How do we choose today to keep focused on Christ and not other things? And finally is this. As you've read through this devotional and you've listened to the video and my words, who can you share this encouragement with today? Close out your time in prayer, and we look forward to joining you again next week with another devotion. Have a great day, y'all.